Our first problem asks us to find a distance between 2 points. Now you can memorize the distance formula, or you can just realize that really you're just using the Pythagorean theorem, which we already know. We know that if we have a right triangle and we have sides A and B, then A squared plus B squared is equal to C squared, where C is the hypotenuse. So if we want to find the distance between 2 points, which would be C, we'll just take the square root. So we're going to use both of these methods to see which one makes more sense to you. You can use either one. So find the distance between these 2 points. If I'm going to use the distance formula, I just label each point. I know each is xy, and I label 1, 1, and the other one label 2 since it's point 2. So we say the distance is, and we subtract the x coordinates, so -9 minus -1, and we subtract the y coordinates, x minus -2. And we'll get the square root of 164. Now, it asks us to give it in radical form, so we want to simplify this if we can. To simplify a radical, I make a prime factor tree, and I place the prime factorization under the radical symbol. Since it's a square root, we're looking for groups of 2. Any group of 2 can come out of the radical, and I'm left with 2 square root of 41. It also asks us to give the answer rounded to 2 decimals. To do the decimal form, we'll need our calculators. So we'll enter in 2 times, and then to get the square root, we're going to hit second x squared, and then 41, and then enter, and I get 12.81. I don't use the distance formula. I always just use the Pythagorean theorem. So I say to myself, if this is -9, 8, and this is -1, -2, these are these 2 points. Well, the distance horizontally would be 8. And the distance vertically from -2 to 8 would be 10. And then I just use the Pythagorean theorem to figure out that same answer we just did a minute ago. Next, we're going to want to find the midpoint between 2 points. So if we were to graph these 2 points, this would be halfway between them. So we can memorize the midpoint, or we can just realize that if we're midpoint, it means we're halfway between the 2 x coordinates and we're halfway between the 2 y coordinates. So we can just take the average. We're going to use the midpoint formula. You label each point, and then you choose this to be point 1 and this should be point 2. And then you say that the midpoint is going to be x1 plus x2 divided by 2. And the y coordinate will be y1 plus y2 divided by 2. And our midpoint will be -3, -1. See, what you're doing is basically taking the average between the x coordinates and the average between the y coordinates. Now this one we will need to memorize the standard form of an equation for a circle. If you notice, the standard form for an equation for a circle, HK is the center and R is the radius. So we start with our formula or equation, and we're going to replace our center, we know is -5, 4. So this is our H and our K. So let's replace H with -5 and K with 4. Okay. Next we have our radius. Our radius is square root of 6. And it will really help if you put parentheses as you're replacing things so you don't mess up the signs. So I end up with x plus 5 squared plus y minus 4 squared is equal to the square root of 6 times the square root of 6, that would be 6. And that's our answer. Now we're going to graph the circle from standard form. So I wrote standard form below our problem. And I want to make sure you realize that for circles, H and K both lie. We said that for quadratics, H lies and K tells the truth, but actually for circles, they're both liars. So whatever you see will be opposite of what it really is. So it's going to be -2, -4. That's going to be my center. Okay? And the reason is because if you had to write this, you'd say x minus -2 squared. That would give me x plus 2. And you'd say y minus -4 squared, and that would give me y plus 4. Now, the other thing we want to realize is that r squared is the number by itself. So r squared is equal to 9. So r, we know, is equal to 3. I really took the square root of both sides, and I really did get plus or minus a 3. But I know that distance is always positive, and that's why I only said r is equal to 3. So if I wanted to graph this, I could graph this by putting in the center at -2, -4. Now, to do the circle itself, I want to realize that the radius is 3 units to the right, 3 units to the left, 3 units up, and 3 units down. So I put in those dots representing 3 units to the right, 3 units up, 3 units to the left, and 3 units down. And then I can sketch in my circle. Okay, so for this problem, we're going to go the other direction. We're going to go from the graph to the equation. So go ahead and write the equation for the standard equation for a circle. And we know that our center is going to be HK. So we already have that. So let's replace H with 2 and K with -4. Now all we need is our radius. But unfortunately, we can't just read it off. It's not a nice even number that we can read off the graph. Instead, it's going to be this distance between the 2 points, 2, -4, and 3, -1. Aha, we already know how to do this. We know that the distance formula tells us to use the distance between the x-coordinates squared plus the difference of the y-coordinates squared, and then take the square root of that. We're just doing the Pythagorean theorem, which I especially think is much easier for these kind of graphical problems. I would just take that distance horizontally squared plus the vertical squared, and then take the square root of that. But if you're going to use the square root formula, then you're going to want to label your points, x and y, and then point 1 and point 2, and fill them into your distance formula. And I get the distance between these 2 points is square root of 10. Remember, this is what we're looking for, this distance. And this distance is the radius. So if we want r squared, then we would take square root of 10 and square it. So r squared will simply be 10. So we'll replace that in our formula, our standard form equation, as 10, because r squared is equal to 10. And we'll clean it up, and this is our answer.